Hey everyone, I'm Rather Coherent. Last week I published a video on the Mystic Fighter problem, but they are not alone because I believe Survivor fighters have a similar problem. And first, let me get into what a main fighter needs to do. Main fighters need to deal with enemies drawn by their cloovers, they need to deal with their own enemies, they need to deal with enemies that spawn in faraway locations that generate doom or do other bad things, and they need to deal with bosses. Sometimes those be bad RNG, and the best they can do is engage something off of their clover and just soak the damage. And as a result, over the course of all of their actions, all the things that they have responsibilities to do, they're going to need to deal damage efficiently over high fist values and in various quantities. They're going to need good movement to go off and deal with the acolytes, and they're going to need good soak to deal with bad RNG sometimes. Because when the enemies are being forced to live because the Chaos Bag hates you or the Mythos deck threw 4 enemies at you at once, sometimes you just have to engage the enemy off of your clover so your clover can keep playing the game and you have to eat the damage. Those are the 3 main things that a fighter is going to need in their deck to perform the responsibilities of being the main fighter, protecting the clover, and dealing with the majority of the enemies in the deck. I want to start off by saying Survivor is a really strong card pool. It has wonderful draw cards with things like At a Crossroads, Take Heart, and Unrelenting. It's incredible at that. Its assets like Sparrow Mask and Fire Extinguisher are incredibly cheap. Even its allies only cost 3 each, which for ally slot is pretty low. Additionally, those cheap assets I was just talking about, Sparrow Mask is +2 to the Mythos stats, and it replenishes basically when the Mythos does something to you. Jessica Hyde and Pete Sylvester make you functionally invincible, and for a fighter, if you happen to need to build those already, getting +1 to your Mythos stats and your fist is great. Hank has a wonderful stat line. You add all of that to it, Jessica, Pete, and Sparrow, we're looking at effectively 6166. He's incredible. The stat line's busted as hell. But I actually don't think very highly of Hank as a character. And that is entirely because of the Survivor fighter problem. As I've said, there are some things a main fighter needs to do. Hank has incredible soak. That's not where he's failing. But these other 2, these are things that survivors struggle with. As a general rule, what survivors are excellent at doing is drawing their cards and surviving the Mythos phase. And that is so important. I cannot overstate how many characters are bad because they can't reliably draw their deck fast enough. How many characters are bad because they can't reliably beat the Mythos enough. The thing Survivor does is fixing the most common problems in the game for other decks. However, the thing Survivor doesn't really do, it doesn't really fight super effectively with Fist, and it doesn't really get clues super effectively with Book. Survivor needs to get its proactive value from something other than Survivor 0 to 5. There are a lot of characters where the character card is giving you proactive value, where the card pool is giving you proactive value. And to switch over to an example of a fucking incredible fighter, this is my Will Yorick deck that I ran in Cyclopean Foundations over a year ago now. And this is it at 20 experience. It would be like scenario 3 or something. And without doing too deep of a deck tech, don't worry about things like Active Desperation, because I was planning on building chainsaws and ultimately regretted ever having chainsaw or any of the cards to support it. The deck's really, really strong at fighting. Because you're Will Yorick, you get action compression. Every time you defeat an enemy, you can recur an asset from your graveyard, which, speaking of, you start off with 10 cards in your graveyard. Just on the front of it, you can tell that Will Yorick's invincible, but when you combine it with level 2 assets in the form of Beat Cop and Guard Dog, you start dealing a ton of testless damage round over round and recurring the assets that do it on top of being invincible. He's got Safeguard for movement hacks. He's got Machete, which is a good enough weapon, and Enchanted Blade, which are good enough. You don't need to do much better than that with the amount of testless damage coming out of the ally slots in this deck. There are tons and tons of ways where expanded card pools and survivor abilities take a character with a Survivor 0 to 5 is not a very strong proactive card pool outside of specifically a couple of things with clue finding. It is a card pool that needs you to find your value and your power elsewhere. And a shitload of survivors do that very, very effectively. Yorick's a great example of a brilliant survivor fighter. But coming over to Hank, Hank doesn't get any assets outside of Survivor. And when you look at what he does get in spirits and innate skills, unfortunately, he doesn't get any movement. The closest thing he gets is quick thinking twice a game, because there's no way in hell he's cycling his deck. He doesn't have enough draw to do it. There is quite simply not any movement in Survivor. And before someone mentions track shoes, I feel like having said that, somebody will undoubtedly mention track shoes. First of all, track shoes are a 3 resource cost card, and you'll notice this deck's economy is no. I will not. I did not run economy because my deck is cheap. Running a 3-cost asset in Survivor is actually a problem, especially when you have other things you are required to set up immediately, like a fighter does have to do. The second problem with track shoes, because the resources are a problem but not the main problem, is that track shoes allow you to move 2 locations instead of 1. So in countless situations, like the Acolyte that you spawn in the next location, track shoes literally aren't even relevant. You have to be a specific 2 locations away for track shoes to help. And then the secondary ability on track shoes where you don't engage enemies as a main fighter is actually frequently detrimental. I've seen a fighter Finn using track shoes get frustrated by it multiple times in a campaign. So I do not think track shoes are good movement. I think they are good movement in the sense of they help you get around big maps. They are not good movement in the sense of they help you move 1 location to deal with enemies that don't spawn with you, which are very frequently exactly 1 location away. Pathfinder, Safeguard, Shortcut, those are the types of cards you want for good movement. Track shoes is fine, but it is nowhere on the same tier as other stuff. And specifically for a main fighter, I feel like it just doesn't really help at all while adding a lot of economy to the deck. Sorry, not adding economy to the deck, but adding economy constraints to the deck. I feel like as a Survivor fighter, there is literally nothing in class that helps you with movement. So lastly, and arguably most importantly, because as much as I value movement, it's because I view fighters as being at a foregone conclusion that if I'm even worrying about having good movement, I must be dealing damage efficiently. I'm easily beating fist values and I'm easily distributing damage in big numbers when I need to. That's not actually true for survivors. Coming back to this Yorick deck that I said was really obviously good. Also, this is a deck where I was planning on building Chainsaw. I would play Survival Knives every single time in the future. But I wanted to build Chainsaw, so I did this and I regretted it. But looking at this Yorick deck, it's using blue weapons, and its damage compression is coming from blue assets. This deck doesn't deal damage with a single red card other than the one I keep pointing to as a mistake, right? And I want to remind you that the Chainsaw I'm talking about is easily at its best in a Yorick deck where it's easily recurable. The fact that I think Chainsaw wasn't good in Yorick is not good because it's about to mean that every time I talk about a Survivor fighter, I think Chainsaw is a bad card. I think it's too janky. I think it has too much support it requires. I think it's too expensive for a Survivor economy to recur the damn thing. And as a result, when you look at the weapons available to Survivor, you come over to like a Silas who's like trying really hard to use the harpoon, or you've got Fire Extinguisher, Meat Cleaver, Sledgehammer, one of Pitchfork, because like you have to run an extra card for consistency when your deck is 35 cards. The cards available to a Survivor fighter tend to say +1 for 2. That's what they hit for. Meat Cleaver can be +2 for 2 if you're lower on horror. You can get a Sledgehammer, which is +1 for 2, or the triple action, which is technically the same rate but with a bigger fist bonus. You can get a Time Worn brand later in a campaign when you have the experience for +2 for 2. Wild. The rate Survivor fighters attack at is they have 3 actions in their turn and they hit twice. That's all you get out of class. You have to get the rest of your damage from somewhere else. And that's a huge problem because the number one thing you need to do is efficiently deal with dangerous enemies. There are plenty of scenarios where you have just a huge ball show up that has like 10 to 20 health. And as a Survivor fighter using a Fire Extinguisher, that is incredibly rough. Coming over to Calvin, Calvin's easily the best poster child for this because the extent of damage he gets when you play a fighter Calvin is Sweeping Kick, which is still on rate at 1 action for 2 damage, but at least it evades the boss so that when it inevitably lives through your 6 damage turn, you'll not get hit by it. You get Long Shot for +1 damage on a fighter evasion test, and you get Brute Force to swing once for 3. And it's not in this deck, but you also get Stunning Blow to make a fight test evade, sort of just like stapling half of Sweeping Kick onto another test as a skill, which is definitely solid. And those 3 skills are the full extent of action compression that the fighter is getting. They aren't getting any movement, and they are not dealing damage over a rate of one action for 2 damage. That's like the bare minimum. That's the requirement to be a fighter at all. And that's also the rate you expect your 30 experienced fighter deck to be rocking up with. Survivor as a class has the most diversity from character to character. And it's because their card pool is a wonderful base, but it doesn't actually do anything on its own. You need strong character abilities, you need strong card pools. And as a result, if you're left with the base Survivor card pool as a fighter, you can end up in a really awkward situation where you're trying to basically kill Haster with a machete, because that's what Fire Extinguisher is. And I think that baseline in Survivor, there is nowhere near enough support for a fighter to be even close to good. When you look at this Hank deck, I've crammed out all the action economy I can in. I've got Rhea Shroud to swing for 4 a couple of times, Sweeping Kick to get a free evade, Long Shot and Brute Force to cram some damage into skills, Quick Thinking for another action, Strong Armed for a guaranteed hit, probably on the Rhea Shroud. Nope, can't use that, it's gotta be an asset, so I guess +1 damage on a Fire Extinguisher it is. And then I won't autofail guaranteed. Like, this is the most action compression I can cram in the deck, and it still feels very low to me because I know that I have to spend every move action myself. There will never be a movement hack. I know that every time a 3 health enemy or a 5 health enemy or a ball shows up, these resources start ticking down. It's all I've got, and I've got to spend them every time a real threat shows up. Hank's card pool doesn't give him as much damage as I want it to give him, and it gives him no movement. And it leaves him as somebody who very clearly has to play main fighter, but is left with a deck that struggles to meet the movement requirements of main fighter, and that isn't very good at dealing huge amounts of damage for the big enemies that demand that sort of response. Hank has insane Mythos resilience, incredible stats, and all the same, I think he's one of the weaker fighters in the game just because he doesn't get access to good weapons. He doesn't get access to any sort of recursive movement hack. He only gets about a third of his deck that gives him slightly above rate for 1 action. And the same thing happening in this Hank deck happens to every Survivor with a largely limited card pool. Calvin suffers the exact same problems when you build him as a fighter, even more so, honestly. I'm not talking about Calvin generally being a shit investigator right now. I'm just talking like assuming Calvin were set up and were playing with the cards the way he wanted to, he still would have all the same problems that Hank does. Coming over to a Silas, there's a huge powerful dream with the Sea Change Harpoon. Like, you assemble that, you're popping off with like Long Shot, Quick Thinking, Strong Armed, all committed at once. But outside of the dream with Sea Change Harpoon, guess who's swinging Fire Extinguisher at base 5 for 2 damage? That's right, it's Silas. Like, I want this Silas deck to be sick because I look at the possibility of Sea Change Harpoon, Quick Thinking, Strong Armed, Long Shot twice, you hit for 5, you get your action back, you return the Harpoon to your hand. And then I'm like, man, how am I paying for that Harpoon though? Because there's no economy in this deck. So obviously changes have to be made. And then I'm like, oh man, you have to find the Harpoon though? And if you don't, you're just swinging for 2 with Fire Extinguisher, which is base 5, you say. And I'm like, oh no, this Silas deck might be all hype, no reality. This might be Disneyland entirely. And I think it is. And the reason it's Disneyland is the fucking Survivor problem. It's because Silas is forced to play a game with Fire Extinguisher and run backpacks to try to find his 1-of Harpoon, and then he can deal with the economy problem and the Mythos problem. It's the same thing holding Silas back. Like, there's a dream that I look at when I see this deck, but the reality is that it's suffering all the same problems in a lot of situations. I had to briefly double check this because I wasn't sure if I believed it, but yeah, I do. I think Yorick is the only good Survivor fighter. I think everyone else who's even trying to participate in that role is held down tremendously by the available card pool. And with Mystics, even though I didn't really focus on it, there is a positive takeaway from their fighter problem, which is there's no reason you have to play your Mystic as a fighter. Your Mystic can just play a flex and not have these responsibilities. They can just play a dedicated cleaver. You don't even have to run the fight assets, right? Mystics are super flexible in what role they pick. So the fact that they have problems as main fighter doesn't really hurt their class. But coming over to Hank Sampson, you're not playing this guy with 1 book as a flex investigator. You're not playing him as a cleaver. He's locked in. Silas and Calvin are locked in. Well, all right, Calvin can do anything. Let me rephrase that. Calvin can't do anything, but that's the same as being able to do anything in terms of how much freedom you have to pick your role. You're equally incompetent in all aspects. It's like, yeah, Calvin can get out of this. He doesn't have to be a fighter, but Silas is playing fighter. Hank is playing fighter. And sure, I've said in the past that like Dark Horse Silas is a pretty good user of a Mariner's Compass, definitely no longer the best. That's been long since taken over by Daryl. But like, Silas can play some other jankier builds and get out of his fighter role. But the fact that this character with this stat line is not trying to play fighter, that I think the best way to play them is to dodge the fight role and play Dark Horse and use Mariner's Compass is crazy. Mystics being pushed into flex and cleaver and not really wanting to play main fighter isn't something that I view as really problematic for the game. Yorick is the only Survivor fighter I respect, and every other option, not that there are really that many, really struggle. And I feel like maybe there's no solution, because like maybe they print like another good level 0 weapon that's just unambiguously good and on par with or better than Meat Cleaver, and then they print like an experienced weapon and they're survivors. It's obviously not going to be a gun. It's going to be some weird shit that is likely infinite. And like the moment they get something that's like Walmart brand runic axe and Walmart brand machete, the fighters just go straight to the moon, right? Like maybe it's not a solvable problem. And on the other hand, I don't really care if they're powerful. There are so many powerful characters in the game. Who cares if Survivor fighters finally get to have fun? I don't know. I feel like Survivor fighters are just crippled by their lack of good weapons. And then when you combine that with their bad movement options, the characters whose card pools don't solve that, or their abilities don't solve that, so like really Hank, Silas, Calvin, get absolutely crushed and cannot do their role properly. The fact that I'm always talking about Dark Horse Flex Silas instead of Fighter Silas is because of the Survivor card pool just not giving him what he needs to be a great fighter. Anyway, that's gonna be it for now. I've been rather incoherent, and this has been my best attempt to articulate why it is that I don't think Survivor fighters are remotely top tier, with the notable exception of Yorick, who's really a Guardian fighter with Survivor recursion. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please do like, comment, and subscribe. All that stuff really does help. And I'll see you in the next one. But before I go, a massive shout out to my supporters on Patreon. I greatly appreciate it.